Okay, everybody, it's Kevin Lockett once again. Today we're talking to author and trained funketeer pianist Daniel Bedrosian. How you doing today, sir?
Good, Kevin. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
The reason we're talking to Daniel today of this amazing book. Oh, look at it. Where are we at? Here we go. The Uprise Punk Song Reference, the official canon of Parliament-Funkadelic, 1956 to 2023. This book is amazing.
Oh, thank you.
I knew it was going to be a lot of songs in here. I didn't know it was going to be that many.
It's a lot.
How did the book come about? Yeah. How did the book come about?
Well, P-Funk's been my favorite band ever since I was about 11 years old. And I told, I was classically trained pianist. My parents were both concert pianists. They ran a piano school in the home. So people were coming in and out of my house all day long playing pianos. There were 4 pianos playing at all times, my whole life, my whole upbringing. And by the time I was about 11, I got bit by the P-Funk bug. I found out about it through sampling, and then I just started buying the albums and getting my hands on whatever I could get my hands on. And I said, I'm going to be the keyboard player for P-Funk when I grow up. I said that around 6th grade, and people were like, yeah, okay, whatever, Danny, whatever. But as early as that period, middle school, high school, and even college, I was keeping track of who played and sang on what songs, because the canon was so massive, and there's so many people in this band, and there's so many people that have been in this band, that to me it was important to try to figure out, listening to the styles of the voices, the drummers, the keyboard players, everything, who's on what, essentially. And once I got into the band and became a full-time member, I started asking those tedious, nitpicky questions to my big brothers and uncles in the group, and just trying to find out as much from the primary sources, from the source. And luckily was able to find out from a lot of the guys, because when I joined, it was 2003. And so a lot of the guys who have sadly passed on since then were still in the group at that time. So I was able to garner a lot of that information from them. And then COVID hit, and I decided, among other things, I'm going to type this thing up finally, formally. And being a history major in college, I knew that legitimation and primary sources were the most important part of the whole thing. So I started interviewing 60 or 70 of the most important band members from the whole 68-year history of the band, including some almost 30 or 40 hours of interviews with George himself, George Clinton. And just started doing that during COVID, and then writing down all the information and getting all these songs down to paper, figuring out who played and who sang on what songs, essentially. And then that's kind of how the book became.
So, like you said, you've been in the band since 2003. So if you knew George for a long time, but you sat down with him for the interview for I think it was around 10 hours. What were some things that you learned that you didn't know before working on the book?
Oh, ton. I mean, he is such an open book, no pun intended, anyway. And every time I'm with him, I'm getting new information from him. Like, he's telling me something new that I was like, really? I didn't know that. But yeah, I've known him since I was 17, started working for him in different aspects of the organization before I was even in the band. And so I've been working for him in some way or another since 98, but started full time as the keyboard player in 2003. So he in the interview process, really it's like 30 or 30 plus hours. I just stopped counting after a certain point, and on the interview list, but like there's some serious hours of interviews with George just since I started typing this thing. But some things I found out, well, for one, Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow, the Funkadelic album, second Funkadelic album from back in 1971. Martha Reeves from Martha and the Vandellas is on that track singing "The Kingdom of Heaven is Within." The Kingdom of Heaven is Within. That's her chanting that in that cultish song. That's Martha Reeves dancing in the street. Martha Reeves. But there's so many weird surprises. Things that, there'd be a song where everybody always thought it was this one person playing. And then George said, no, it's this person. And George's memory is so incredible. It's so intact that he remembers a person, even if they did one session on one song out of this massive canon. I think in the book, it's something like 850 releases, and 90% of those are albums. So he remembers if somebody did one song, like the song I Bet You from the first Funkadelic album. Everybody always thought that was original drummer Tiki Fullwood playing the famous drum intro, which has been sampled a million times. But it's just, George was like, something Smith. He said, it's something Smith. And then I found out later, he said the next day he remembered it. Andrew Smith, that's his name, who's a famous session drummer from Detroit who played on a bunch of different things, Undisputed Truth and with other people. So yeah, surprises abounded all over the place. There was almost every question was like, that's so-and-so, right? He's like, no. That's what people think. But it was actually this, that went on and on and on. And he wasn't the only one giving up surprises. I mean, all of the guys and ladies who I interviewed from the band's 68-year history, everybody was so cool and so cordial. I mean, we all know each other from being in this massive band, but some of these people are people whose tenures are separated from mine by 20, 30, 40 years. Like, we've never been in the band together at the same time in many cases. And even they treated me like we were in the same little four-piece band, and like we'd been in the band together, so it was really cool. Great experience, and lots of surprises.
Is it interesting when you talk about 70s R&B, 70s soul music? And of course, we talk about Stevie Wonder and Earth, Wind and Fire. You had the Jacksons and the Commodores. You had all these different acts. But sometimes, far too often, Parliament does not, or the P-Funk, they never are in that conversation. And like you said, in this canon of songs, they had songs that people knew, songs that people love. But when it comes to like, oh yeah, we love Stevie Wonder. Oh, absolutely love Stevie. Oh my God, Earth, Wind and Fire. I do the same thing. Oh my God, Sly Stone. But like George, they about those conversations. I don't think people mean to slight them. It just seems like they're just almost overlooked.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because a lot of ways people talk about, they say the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. You ever heard that terminology? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
If you do a movie, or you can get back to Kevin Bacon with 6 degrees, it's 2 degrees of P-Funk. So every name you named, I can take that back to P-Funk in really 1 degree or 2. So like Stevie Wonder, for instance, all the same musicians who played on his records played on George and the Parliament's first records, the Funk Brothers. In fact, George was a songwriter when Stevie was little Stevie Wonder at Motown. So they worked together, and all the same people worked in that same world. Getting back to the Jacksons, Jackson 5, another song I just mentioned, I Bet You. I Bet You was a song originally written for the Jackson 5 on the ABC album, the first Jackson, really the most famous Jackson 5 album. And George is a songwriter and wrote that song on that album. Earth, Wind and Fire was really Parliament's big competitor in the 70s. They were kind of like, it was kind of like the Beatles and the Stones, but for funk. It was like that kind of comparison. And Earth, Wind and Fire themselves, who they've played with us many times, even they said, P-Funk would come and just tear the roof off literally, and just other bands wouldn't want to go on after P-Funk played. P-Funk would say, oh yeah, we can open if you want. And then nobody would want to come on after them because they were so notorious for their stage show. But even Earth, Wind and Fire has covered Make My Funk the P-Funk, which is almost antithetical to the whole rivalry. But they were the one, they could Make My Funk the P-Funk. Earth, Wind and Fire has covered that song. And Jessica Cleaves, the great soprano singer, who's on Not Just Knee Deep, she was totally deep, but she did the freak with me. She was in Earth, Wind and Fire first and sang on the Open Our Eyes and Head to the Sky albums. Commodores, Billy Bass Nelson played on several Commodore albums, Machine Gun and many others. And I can go on, and it's not just funk groups. It's not just R&B groups. It goes across the spectrum of genres, from rock and heavy metal to hip hop and soul, R&B, gospel, blues, classical. doo-wop, world music. It goes across all these things. And in a lot of ways, maybe 30 years ago, 35 years ago, people were saying the Beatles are the most important popular culture icon for pop music history. But there have been several articles written in the last 20 years about, well, no, it's actually Parliament-Funkadelic, because Parliament-Funkadelic, the most sampled group of all time. B, their influence runs across genres. They didn't just, most big acts influence just one group. They're not diverse like P-Funk. If you go to a P-Funk show, there's every color in the rainbow, every type of person, every age group, people from every country. We play all 6 livable continents through the year. I've played all those lines. And then it's just that unifying kind of notion, one nation under a groove, and their topics, which were social and political, and went into things that some of the other more pop groups didn't go into because their record label told them not to. George was kind of daring with his stuff, and he was also able to put out a more massive output because his business practices, though Byzantine as they were really ahead of their time, where he had a number of different acts under a number of different record labels. So no one label owned all of his music. So at the exact same time that Parliament was on Casablanca, Funkadelic was on Warner Brothers, and the Brides of Funkenstein and Bernie Worrell were on Arista, and Bootsy's Rubber Band was on Warner's, and and on and on and on. They did it like this throughout the whole period and continue to. And it's that largesse of catalog that nobody compares to. Some people try to compare it to Zappa, but Zappa had about 88 albums in his collective's history. We're talking about 800 plus. And I've already found, I'm working on the second edition now. My publishers won't let me release it for a couple of years, but I've already found 90 albums that I didn't include to be added to the book, and an additional 10 albums that have come out since the book was published. So that shows just the productivity, the power, the output, the input, the influence of P-Funk. And it's the kind of thing, George just got his star on the Hollywood Walk. And, the band's got the Lifetime Achievement Grammy that we received back in 2019. And they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The mothership is in the Smithsonian in the African-American culture area, African-American studies and culture area. And it's just starting to reach academia. Luckily, with this book, we've been doing book tours in places like colleges and other institutions of higher learning to kind of increase the knowledge, because it's something that I always call the hidden influence. It could be from Rage Against the Machine to Erykah Badu to Dr. Dre to Blind Boys of Alabama to on and on and on. What do all these groups have in common? George Clinton and P-Funk. It's the one sort of marrying, unifying factor that has found its way into almost every group known to man in popular music, and many not known. So it's just one of those things. The influence goes way, way further. And I think George's longevity has also played a part because he just kept doing it. He's never stopped. So to add another kind of important talking point, 68 years. There's no other group in popular music history that can claim 68 years. The only other group that has a higher count is not in popular music. It's Blind Boys of Alabama, who I just mentioned, but they're a gospel group. They started in the 30s, and then arguably almost none of their members are even around from that period. With George, you've got a 68 unbroken tenure, 68-year unbroken tenure, and a good 12, 13 or more members of the band are those guys who came in the 70s during the quote unquote heyday. So really, there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. It's a movement. It's a, the fans of P-Funk consider it a religion more than they do a band or a group. It's become it's its own subgenre, aside from funk, aside from R&B, aside from rock. And I think the sort of catalyst of all that is, for a long time, people always said they were too white for the blacks, too black for the whites. And that was a thing that happened for a really long time in the 60s, certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But what's fascinating that's happened is in recent years, and I want to say the last, since I've been in the band, last 20 years, because of the internationalizing of communications between the internet and the way that the world market has become this massive thing, and the way everything's much faster and easier to communicate. I mean, just what we're doing right now. You could be in Hong Kong and we could be doing this. That advancement, that technological advancement, but also that advancement of the mind and that advancement of modernity has allowed the disenfranchised. If it was 40 years ago, 50 years ago, people were saying they're too black for whites, too white for blacks. Today, due to modernity and due to the innovation of humankind, the disenfranchised people have become the majority. And in that, when I say the disenfranchised people, I just mean people who feel like this neat fit doesn't fit me. This one thing that everybody says I'm supposed to go for, it doesn't fit me, how I feel. Today, the world is more that than ever before. The people are speaking for themselves now in a way where they're like, and this amalgam, this mutated brand that George has created has now become the norm. It's become pop culture, and the things that he helped innovate and create on wax, so to speak, have now become these influences and these things that have like permeated all the way up to pop culture as we know it. So it's the kind of thing you could write several treatises about. There need to be more books about P-Funk because of its all-encompassing influence. But that's just not to go too deep, but that's a good answer to your question.
Right. I hope I got this correct. The first P-Funk song to go #1 is Flashlight. Did I have that right? Or am I wrong?
Yeah, well, you're mostly right. So Parliament-Funkadelic first hit was Flashlight. However, Bootsy's Rubber Band had a #1 hit the month before that, and it was Bootzilla, which was Bootsy's first big hit. And
Right.
You got to include it as part of P-Funk because George wrote those and produced those albums. It's all the same guys on the records, and it's all coming out from the same camp. So technically it's Bootzilla, but if we're saying just Parliament-Funkadelic, the just the core two groups, yes, Flashlight.
So let's talk about the reason I brought up Flashlight. Let's talk about the genius of Bernie Worrell. Because George is George, right? Mm-hmm. George is fantastic, but let's talk about Bernie. Well, what was Bernie's contribution to this sound that we love so much?
I mean, I've mentioned many times in the past that he's probably the second most important figure. And a lot of people try to argue me down and say Bootsy. I say, well, Bernie's been there longer, and he was more important to contributing to what was the sound of P-Funk, as it were. Without Bernie Worrell's contributions on keyboard, synthesizer, piano, and arranging, it wouldn't have been P-Funk, even if you had a Bootsy. I was Bernie's protege for several years. I studied under Bernie, and the lessons I learned from him, being a fellow classically trained musician himself, he has an honorary doctorate from New England Conservatory. He went to Juilliard and the Conservatory. He was a genius classical pianist. Without that classical part, P-Funk would not be what it is. It would be another doo-wop group or another psychedelic rock group or another R&B group. It would have not been his injection of arranging skills, of orchestration. Even on a hit like we talk about Aqua Boogie, which was the next big Parliament hit after Flashlight, Aqua Boogie has some 6 keyboards and synthesizers on it. 6. And a lot of people associate that with being like a dance funk song. But me, as a classical guy, I hear Bach. I hear Bach in Bernie and Chopin. And that's it's that orchestration. It's that ability to meld and weave these parts in and out, and not just what he's playing stylistically, but how he's doing it. And in Bernie's feel, was the cornerstone to what we consider the P-Funk feel. Because P-Funk, that feel, that pocket, that real pocket where they pull back hard on that backbeat. And that was really Bernie. I know Bootsy brought the one from the James Brown, everything's on the one, but that pullback and that pocket, that feel, that was all Bernie Worrell, or a big portion of it was Bernie Worrell. And he can't be understated. His contribution cannot be understated to the songs, to the vibe and the feel of that music. And, you know, I was on the road with him for some 3 or 4 years, but I probably got like decades worth of lessons from the guy, because we were together almost 24 hours a day between on the bus at sound check. We'd have like a 6 to 9 hour sound check. In those days, we were playing 4 to 6 hour shows. Everything was a lesson with Bernie. He would show you, okay, this is the way I played it on the record, but every measure I played it a different way based on the variation. So he'd show me 5 or 6 different ways to play each part in a song. You can play with this inversion, this inversion, this inversion. Okay, now this way, this inversion, for every section. And a lot of people just know that sort of, I don't know, top 40-ish version of how they would play it. Bernie would show you the real workings of the canon, how it was played, and all the variations therein. That's Bach. That's all Bach. You know, if he was born in a different time, if he was born way back in the day, he would have been this misunderstood, massively important classical composer. If he was born 40 years later than he would have been as important as like Jacob Collier or somebody, or even more important, because of his musical contribution and his importance, his ability to correspond with theory and technique into music that was tangible for the world to hear. And I guess most importantly, he was the first person to really incorporate Western European orchestral music, symphonic music, with African American R&B, blues, and soul. There is no contemporary of that. There's no other person you can compare that to, really, across the popular music spectrum. So yeah, his contribution was everything.
What's the main difference between Parliament and Funkadelic, and then later with the P-Funk All-Stars? Because I think I know what Funkadelic is. So I could tell the difference, but for most people, they might say, oh, well, that was a Parliament, that was a Funkadelic song, or that was a Funkadelic song, was actually a part. So what was the main difference between Parliament, Funkadelic, and then later the P-Funk All-Stars?
Yeah, it's a great question. And most lay people don't know that. So it's a really important one for people trying to figure out what P-Funk is all about. So it starts with the Parliaments. The Parliaments is the singing group. It was the doo-wop group. George was influenced by Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers and all that stuff coming out of the 50s. Group starts in 55. Their first recordings are in 56. They lose the right to the Parliament's name sometime around 68, 69. So they can't use the name anymore after that point. So they bring the backup band to the forefront, which was Funkadelic. So Funkadelic is essentially the 5 guys in the rhythm section who they push to the front, with the Parliaments singing the vocals, but the Funkadelics also sang too. And Funkadelic is more rock driven. It's more psychedelic, at least at its infancy. When you're talking about those first 7 or 8 albums, it's guitar dominated, it's heavy, it's grungy, it's loud, it's experimental, it's crazy to most people. It was the albums that were most akin to, say, the MC5 or Iggy Pop and the Stooges or the Velvet Underground, really experimental, progressive stuff. And it was George's vehicle for his most ferocious political and social messages, social upheaval, political messaging, America Eats Its Young, and all of that stuff. That came through the Funkadelic lens. Parliament, once they were able to use the name again, they dropped the S and still focused it as the vocal side of the group. However, when it kind of came back in full form, they were dominating it with a lot of horns horn heavy, much in the same style as other funk groups of that time that were doing the exact same thing at the exact same time, like Kool and the Gang before they went pop, Ohio Players, Earth, Wind and Fire before they got more poppy, and a few other groups. Horn dominated, keyboards and stuff, but there's really keyboards in both, but a little bit more focusing on the dance floor with Parliament. So Parliament was more trying to move people on the dance floor, and Funkadelic was more trying to change the way you think. But then, with the coming of the platinum albums and with the coming of #1 hits, so that period like 76, 77, 78, the lines start blurring, especially with the massive domination of the Funkadelic single One Nation Under a Groove, which it almost could have been a Parliament song, except George said he really wanted it to be a movement. And he knew that Funkadelic was more a movement and Parliament was more a hit machine. Funkadelic, that ended up being a massive hit, but it was also a movement in its own. And it was the longest running #1 R&B hit for the P-Funk, staying on the charts back in 78, 79 for about 8 or 9 weeks. So it was their biggest hit of all time. And it began the blurring of the lines. So now you could have a guitar solo on a Parliament album or a dance-friendly hit on a Funkadelic album, and it wouldn't be faux pas anymore. Before, the lines were drawn. Funkadelic is rock. It's more adult to the college audiences. Some would argue more white, but that's a little vague because Funkadelic was huge in the black neighborhoods, especially in the early period. But it was also really big at the white colleges. So that was Funkadelic. Parliament was a little bit more high school, college, and Funkadelic was more college. So like Parliament was hits for high school kids on the radio, big radio hits for the teenagers, older teenagers, and then they would also say, just to throw that in, Bootsy was for the even younger. So they have like the GPs, like the Bootsy fans. That was for the kids who were like preteens or early teenagers. So that was kind of how they broke that all down.
Right. So Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis are my favorite producers of all time. And of course, Quincy Jones is the GOAT. And you have a lot of great producers. Prince was great. You got the Neptunes today and all this stuff. But even I'm guilty of this, that I skip over George Clinton. Because I saw that Warm Bounce by Zapp. Zapp is one of my favorite bands ever. And I saw that the sound for More Bounce was a loop of different musics that George had concocted. Tell us how underrated George Clinton is or was as a producer. Because people don't think of him that way. They think of the crazy guy with the crazy hair and outfits, but they don't see him as the musical genius producer that he is.
Yeah, in my opinion, he's right up there with Quincy because, and people like Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, massively influenced by George. I mean, first of all, they sampled a bunch of P-Funk in a lot of their things they did with people from Janet Jackson and all kinds of people. But George's production input is also cannot be understated. To this day, he's one of the most amazing producers I've ever seen. And the way that he leads on stage is he's producing on stage. He's literally doing what he does in the studio on stage, like how he would do with the Q mic in the studio. But his production technique is he was open to a lot of ideas, which allows him to be able to do a lot of different things, but he knows exactly what he wants, and he's willing to put that time in. I've never seen another producer put in the amount of time George puts in. He will do a 32-hour session. He will sit there night after night and continue the job until it's done. In the days of the reel-to-reels, when they were doing everything on tape, he'd have 40 singers in there. And he was so specific about how he'd want people to do a cadence, just a moment of a cadence. He could spend days on that moment. And it would be, we're just doing this today. This is all we're doing. And the same thing with even hand claps. He would have people clap up or clap down, clap behind the beat, clap in front of the beat. He had so many formulas. And it came from growing up in that Smokey Robinson and the Beatles and Dylan at the same time. He was there for Motown, and he saw the crossover into psychedelia with Jimmy and with the Beatles and all that stuff, Sgt. Pepper and all that. And he had so much input. You know, you have to understand that by the time George was starting to produce, he had already had 20 or 25 years under his belt as a songwriter, a lead singer, you know, and so he had already learned from Berry Gordy's and all of these people. And so he was able to inject originality, and none of those songs would have been what they were if anybody else had produced them. Anybody, even a great producer like a Norman Whitfield, they would have just put too much of the wrong thing in there. George, like Sly said once, George doesn't need to learn anymore, because if he did, he'd probably mess it up, because what he knows and what he does with what he knows is so genius, and it's so unorthodox, that if he had gone and like gotten like formal lessons in whatever production or whatever, it would have probably lost that edge, you know, because you can find productions he's done that are extremely experimental and dirty, like the first 3 Funkadelic albums. Nothing sounds like them. And then you can find things that are so clean and so amazing, like Mothership Connection album, Funkadelic album, One Nation album, Computer Games from his own solo career, and some of the stuff he did with P-Funk All-Stars albums. Clean and moving sonically right into the future and informing hip-hop as it was happening, you know? Forget the sampling. His production style was informing Prince, all of hip-hop, the Chili Peppers. They were getting their production style from George, directly from George. Not even just the music style, the production style. You listen to Prince records, you listen to the Chili Peppers, especially like their first few albums, and any hip-hop from 87 to 97 or later is all just straight from George's production mind. It is an extension of everybody from Digital Underground, De La Soul. They're all kind of admittedly copying from his production technique. And the way he does it, he's still that guy that artists want to come in. We had just worked with Mono Neon recently on a bunch of sessions. And he, you know, I was saying to Mono, I was like, you know, whenever George goes into somebody else's studio, he kind of kindly sits back and lets the new guys or whoever it is do their thing. But I'm always saying, no, let George, you need to show them what you do. And Mono was like, that's what I want. I want that. I want that George production. And that's what people want when they go in with him, because he's just such a genius with how he crafts songs on a production level.
You know, there's always the classic story about James Brown, how hard he was when it comes to rehearsals. Prince adopted that mentality. Even Jackson, I don't think he was as hard as those guys, but Michael Jackson was a stickler how things should go. And the thing about George Clinton was that, well, you know, when you join, do what they did on stage, the amounts of instruments that's on stage. You have to be a conductor to pull that stuff in. Now, again, you weren't around in the 70s during their peak. You came in 2003. But from your experience of what you learned, what was the formula of them practicing? Because you can't be that good just freewheeling it. You got to be trained. Like you said, Bernie was classically trained. You got to be really good at playing these instruments and moving from song to song. No matter how much partying they did, you have to have some type of structure.
Yeah. So the feel, the basis of a lot of their stuff was their feel, which was unmatched. And it was the cornerstone of that sound. But as far as like rehearsal, George, well, all the constituent members in any era are consummate musicians. They practice, including myself. I mean, not to pat myself in the back or anything, but I mean, practice, you know, between 3 and 7 hours a day. And that's just my classical regiment. That's not even what I practice for bands on stage. So every one of these guys has a massive practice regimen on their own. We'll start there. That's the foundation, and that's daily. Then when you're on the road, you've got sound check, which is a chance to get some rehearsing in. besides getting the line check and the sound check and getting all the technical stuff down, there is a good period for, I'm the current music director. I have been for quite some time. And so we get a chance to get rehearsal in. All right, let's try. They'd be like, Danny, what do you want to do? And I'll say, okay, let's we'll call off 6 or 7 songs and we'll rehearse those pretty heavy. And then I'll tell George before the show, hey, I want to let you know today at soundcheck, we rehearsed this, and this. And he might call one of those. He might even start the show with one of those. In addition, if there's something special we have to do, we'll do a series of rehearsals at a spot. This is more rare if it's for TV or if it's for an event where we have to play stuff we've never played before, like a new album worth of music or new material or a medley that's specific to this one show. Yeah, then he'll drill us in the rehearsal spot for quite a while. And that could be an all night into the morning type of thing. It's a little more rare because, see, there's tons of rehearsing going on. But with George, every night the show is different. There is no set list. This is the only band that's like this that I know. He comes up to us before the show, 5 minutes before, and he tells me what the first song is going to be. And he tells me to tell everybody. Then 30 seconds before the show, he might change his mind and say something else, and I have to tell everybody something else. And then throughout the show, he mouths what the next song is going to be to us right in between songs. So you just got to read lips. He just goes, and you just have to know what that is. And we count it off into the next song. Every show is like this. He's done it like this forever. So we don't really know what we're going to do until we're literally right in the moment. And to add to that, getting back to, the book, you see how big the canon is. It's a toy box for George. He could do whatever the heck he wants. So he might call a song in the middle of a medley and we could be playing in B, but the song, the original, is in E flat or something. No, you got to transpose it to B because the groove's in B right now. We got to play this song in B. So you kind of got to know hundreds, if not thousands, of songs in every key. And you got to know the way every constituent player played it. So the keyboard players in P-Funk are something of an endangered species. We're like the least of us left. So where there's like 10 drummers from the P-Funk left, not in the band right now, but that have been there that are alive.
Right.
There's about 9 or 10 guys who have had the guitar chair that are still alive. Horns, same thing. Vocalists, a huge number. Keyboards, there's only 4 of us left that are alive. But there have been some 12 to 16 guys on or off that have been there either in the live group or in the studio that are like the main guys who played on the records and were on the shows. You have to know not just how Bernie played it on the record, and I already told you all of his variations, so that whole Bernie canon. Then you have to know the way each constituent guy played it. Because if it comes to a certain medley that was written in the time that guy was the keyboard player, then it's going to be in his style. Or if something is done in an arrangement that was arranged by that particular guy, it's going to be his way. And not just style, but the whole technique could be different. Even the notes could be different from how the original is. The rhythms that he does, something like Atomic Dog, every one of the keyboard players after David Lee Chong, who did the original, they all played it differently. Just the intro, even the there were guys who went da 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 da. There were guys who did it in fifths. There were guys who did it from D to A. There were guys who did it from A to D. All kinds of variations, and you just kind of have to be on your toes and ready for whatever it is that the occasion calls for, because that is how you keep a gig. Me having a 21-year unbroken tenure is kind of unheard of in this band. I'm the longest tenured keyboard player in the group, just a year over Jerome Rogers, who had 19, and just a year over Bernie, who had 18. But most players, they don't last super long in this group, whether by their own volition because it's just too much to deal with, or because they just don't cut it because there's so much you have to essentially know. And the mirage for the fans or for the audience is that this is one big party. We're just partying. But meanwhile, George is giving us very specific instructions on stage. I wouldn't say he's as strict as James, but he's almost as strict as James. And people like Questlove from The Roots have said, you know, people who have been in George Clinton and James Brown's bands have had the hardest job in popular music for the past 50 years. And it's true. You have to watch George's foot for rhythm cues. You have to watch the way he hits the mic or the way he claps. He is dominating the tempo, the feel, the style, the way you play your part consistently the entire show. There is not one moment where he's like, okay, do what you want. Now, you might have certain leeway with him as a specific player if he trusts you, but that trust comes from decades and decades of confidence in a specific player. So he might let me get away with more than another guy, possibly, but only because I've proven whatever I've proven. And he might make a certain drummer do more of what he's telling them than another player because he wants a very specific thing from the drummer. So yeah, George is a stickler, and you have to watch his body language. You have to watch his mouth. You have to read his lips and know his canon forwards and backwards. Especially if you're in the rhythm section and the horn section, you just have to be way on point.
What did you learn about Maggot Brain or Free Your Mind during your research? Anything kind of surprised you about those albums?
Well, besides the Martha Reeves thing, which I talked about before,
Yeah.
The Maggot Brain album was, everybody knows, George, well, a lot of people know George turned down all the other instruments on the title track and had Eddie Hazel kind of shine in that. And so, you hear Eddie, but there are versions. There's a version, I talk about it in the book. There's a version that has the full band where you can hear the full band and what they played. And it's very interesting. It's not even what we play now as the accompaniment, and it makes sense why George pulled it out because it's kind of odd. It's cool, but it's not what we know of as Maggot Brain today because it has grown out of that guitar solo and everything accompanying that guitar solo. As far as surprises, a lot of that stuff was a little bit more straight and narrow because luckily there were fewer players in the group at that time. So on Free Your Mind and Maggot Brain, you have a set like 10 guys and 2 or 3 girls. And it's the 5 original Parliaments, the 5 Funkadelics, and then what we call Hot Buttered Soul, which is Pat Lewis's the vocalist. They sang with Isaac Hayes too. They sang with a million people. Pat Lewis is all over a million records. But they're kind of the mainstays on that album, on those 2 albums. And it's really the period before that when George is first formulating Funkadelic and using like a mixture of like the Funk Brothers from Motown and the Funkadelic guys, and the period after that when it's like a transition and he's starting to get other musicians from different places and pulling people from here, and they go to Canada and they go to the UK, and then that's when the albums become sprawling with guest musicians and session players, and you don't know from track to track, it's like different. And it's so really the period you mentioned, those 2 are a little more cut and dry just in terms of it's like these 12 or 13 people, luckily. And it's a lot of the stuff on either right side of it that's more difficult.
One of my favorite songs of all time, because I just listened to it yesterday because I haven't heard it in a while, because I came across it when I was in college, is Pumping It Up from the P-Funk All-Stars. What do you think of some of the most underrated songs in the P-Funk canon?
Pumping It Up is awesome. That's really cool that you like that. I want to throw in a fun fact. Pumping It Up was one of the biggest P-Funk hits in the UK. So in the UK, that was a bigger hit than most of the stuff that was a big hit in the US. And yeah, it's a great tune. Urban Dance Floor Gorillas. It's a great P-Funk All-Stars album. Yeah, some of the more underrated stuff. That's some of my favorite stuff. I'm always the kind of fan where I like the album right before the album where the band blows up. So whatever that one is right before, that's usually the artistic peak before the commercial success. So to me, a good example of that with P-Funk is the 1975 album Let's Take It to the Stage by Funkadelic, which is, to P-Funk fans, massive core album, super important. And it had some singles, but it's right before Mothership Connection by Parliament, which was the first platinum album. So right before that platinum success, you've got this massive artistic explosion. And to this day, Let's Take It to the Stage is my favorite album of all time. The songs, the production, the sound, everything was just perfect. Every song, you just run down the song list on that album, it's just massive. A lot of songs that we still do live today, a lot of great studio cuts that were just so moving and emotional and interesting and introspective and inspirational. It just changed me, as a music listener, as a musician. It's my favorite album to this day, not just P-Funk, of all albums, is Let's Take It to the Stage. And I highly recommend people who haven't heard it. And I also want to go back to something I didn't touch on from one of your earlier questions that I meant to. You talked about more bounce to the ounce, kind of moving around, jumping around, but that was from another song that Roger and Zapp were doing, where it had like a whole bunch of parts. And there was, like, George described it as, there's too many parts. There's just too much going on. And he said they just are not able to stay in one place, and it's not interesting. Like, it doesn't grab you, more importantly. It was a cool song, but it just didn't grab you. George found this one moment. He was like, that's it. And they wanted to just hit that once and move on. George said, no, that's the whole song. And they looked at him like he was crazy. And he took the tape, and that was back when the way you looped tape back then, you had to like wind it around the room, and he had just that one section looped. Boom, 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 that whole moment. And that became the entire song. That was the vamp. And if it weren't for George's wherewithal and genius, really, of knowing what the moment is, we wouldn't have had a more bounce to the ounce. And more importantly, for people who know Zapp, that's their whole sound. Every Zapp album has a more bounce clone, which is really usually their most popular song, until they started getting into the ballads, and the ballads became popular. But that's a decade later. All of those Zapp songs, whether it's Dance Floor, I Can Make You Dance, Doo-Wah Diddy, all that stuff, even their cover of Grapevine, it's all trying to duplicate more bounce. It's all trying to duplicate more bounce. And they would even tell you that. More bounce to the ounce is the formula that makes a Zapp song. So without George's wherewithal to isolate that section and say, this is the song, we would have never had Zapp's catalog. There would be no Zapp catalog that we know. Zapp would have probably been a little bit more, it probably would have been more diverse, but it probably would have been less interesting and less popular. So it would have been just a side note instead of a hit-making band, which is what they became. But More Bounce was that first hit, and it was the reason why they created that formula. So I just wanted to throw that in there because you mentioned it, and it's an important note.
No, that's really good. Really good. I guess I'll end on this, maybe, unless I think of something else. The Groove, that came out in 1979. Am I right about that? Because usually I'm bad with dates.
Yeah, the album came out in 78, okay. And I think the single was released officially in 79, but the album with the song was in 78.
So 79, that ends up being the biggest song of 1979, which is a crazy year because Michael Jackson's Thriller was out. So if you ask someone, what was the biggest song of 1979? It's like, probably Off the Wall. It's like, no, it's One Nation Under a Groove. What from your research and talking to George, what went into that song? Why did that song still have staying power? Why did that become almost like the signature song of Parliament-Funkadelic? Just the whole P-Funk sound.
Yeah. So, well, one thing, the Thriller was later, right? So Thriller was 83, I think, because
I'm sorry, I meant Off the Wall.
Off the Wall.
Yeah, I meant Off the Wall.
Because,
79.
But there's an interesting parallel with Thriller because Atomic Dog, which was the big, huge hit in 83, was bookended on either side by two Thriller songs. It was Billie Jean and maybe it was Thriller. Thriller and Billie Jean were like the two hits in between, and right in between the two was Atomic Dog. But with One Nation Under a Groove, I think it was just the time was right for it. Funkadelic up until that point had been a rock dominated kind of psychedelic, crazy, experimental thing, and then One Nation hits very pop. To George, here's the other interesting thing about George. Something that you and I would think is only a little weird, like halfway weird, to George is like cornball bubblegum. So like we'd be like, oh, that's a little strange, but not all the way strange. He's like, oh, that's bubblegum. Like, so they were trying to be as pop as possible on One Nation. And it proves George's his real know-how, that if he wanted to be as massive of a hit maker as, say, Quincy Jones or any of those, he could have. He chose to be odd and underground for a number of reasons that he would get into. But when he chooses to be pop, then you have things like One Nation Under a Groove. And it is, I mean, again, their longest running hit. It's also the beginning of the group having like 16 to 30 backup singers on a song. These massive choirs of people singing on that song. George's production know-how was so intricate. He was able to make that sound like not that many people, because he was real slick with how he produced vocals. And a special shout out to Gary Scheider, of course, as well, who was also a big part of vocal arranging in those days. But with reference to One Nation, George was super slick with that one. And it was just, I think, the right time for P-Funk to hit on a commercial level. They just had Flashlight, and now One Nation was the next big single from the P-Funk camp. And yeah, I think it was just the time was right for it. And George knew how to from his 50s days, it was 60s days with Motown, he knew how to put together a good pop song. He just chose to be different most of the time. And here was Funkadelic, the kind of definition of different, finally putting out this pop record. It's funny though too, because even at the time, even though it made huge waves on the R&B radio, Rolling Stone magazine did a review of the One Nation Under a Groove album as a whole, and said something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, but something along the lines of Funkadelic is sometimes sounds dirty, offbeat, crazy, whatever, but it's the strongest representation of African-American life and life on the street as we know it in contemporary American society, or something along those lines. What's interesting is they're using One Nation Under a Groove album to make that description. But if you listen to that album, it is the most polished album George has ever done. It is super polished. So even the rock songs on there are like Queen. They're like Queen. They're not like dirty and grungy like Rolling Stones or something like that. They're like clean, like Queen songs or David Bowie or something. They're very tight and orchestrated. Everything he did on that record was tight and orchestrated for a purpose. So even some like a pop magazine like Rolling Stone is likening them to this dirty thing, but it's the best representation of reality, which is something that they used to as a metaphor with hip hop a decade or two later, you know. But it's interesting that this great pop album that George made was still considered by the top pop people as this off-kilter crazy thing, even though to George it was like the cleanest thing he ever did.
Right. Well, Daniel Bedrosian, thank you for the conversation. Please pick up this book. P-Funk, the Authorized. Man, I hate my camera. It's always just around. Yeah, P-Funk, the song reference, the official canon of Parliament-Funkadelic, 1956 to 2023. Daniel Bedrosian, where can they find you if they have more questions about this book?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram. It's just my name, Danny Bedrosian. You can find me on Facebook, same thing. X, Twitter, same thing. I have a Patreon. It's patreon.com/Danny Bedrosian. You can get updates, things about, I have the second edition coming in a few years, but I also have another book, secret right now, but it's coming next year. And And I highly recommend that people recommend the book at their local library and local booksellers, but they can find it online at Amazon with the publisher Rowman and Littlefield. It is available online through Barnes and Noble and Books A Million, everywhere books are sold. And you can find it in a lot of brick and mortar places. But if you don't see it in yours, recommend it at your local brick and mortar bookseller, and they'll stock it.
All right. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
No problem.